I'm a truck driver, and I've been on the road for years. I've driven through every kind of weather, every type of terrain, and countless small towns and lonely stretches of highway. But there's one night I'll never forget, a night that changed everything for me and made me question what I thought I knew about the world. It started like any other long-haul trip. I was hauling a load of electronics from Seattle to Salt Lake City, a route I'd taken many times before. The truck was fully loaded, and the engine purred smoothly as I drove through the night. It was a little past midnight when I found myself on a stretch of Interstate 84 that cuts through some pretty isolated parts of Idaho. The sky was overcast, and the rain was coming down steadily. I could barely see beyond the headlights, and the rhythmic sound of the rain hitting the windshield was almost hypnotic. The road was wet and glistening, and I had to stay focused to keep the truck steady. I was listening to an old country station on the radio, something to keep me company and drown out the monotony of the drive. The music was soothing, a mix of classic tunes and gentle voices, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The rain seemed to be coming down harder, and the darkness felt heavier than usual. Then, out of nowhere, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, I thought it might be a mirage or a trick of the rain. But as I got closer, I saw it was a man, soaked and shivering, waving his arms desperately. I slowed down and pulled over, my heart pounding with a mix of concern and caution. I rolled down the window, and the man stumbled towards me. He looked like he had been through a lot. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his eyes were wide with fear. The rain was pouring down, soaking him through. "Please, help me," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "You have to help me. They're coming. They're always coming." I hesitated for a moment, my instincts telling me to be careful. But I couldn't just drive away and leave him out there. I opened the door and motioned for him to get in. He climbed into the cab, dripping water all over the floor, and sat down heavily in the passenger seat. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to make sense of the situation. "Who's coming?" The man looked around nervously, his eyes darting to the windows and then back at me. "I don't know how to explain it," he said, his voice trembling. "They come out of nowhere. They're always looking for people. You have to get me out of here." I tried to get more information out of him, but he just kept glancing nervously at the road. It was clear he was terrified, and it made me uneasy. I started driving again, hoping that if I could get him to a safer place, he might calm down and tell me what was really going on. The rain continued to fall, and the truck's wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour. The road ahead was dark and empty, and I felt like we were the only ones left in the world. The only sound was the steady roar of the engine and the relentless patter of the rain. As we drove, I noticed that the man seemed increasingly agitated. He kept looking out the windows and fidgeting in his seat. Every so often, he would mutter something under his breath, but I couldn't make out the words. Then, out of nowhere, the radio crackled to life. The music stopped, and static filled the cab. I reached to adjust the dial, but before I could do anything, a garbled, distorted voice came through. It sounded like it was speaking in another language, or maybe just an old, broken signal. The man's eyes went wide with terror. "They're here," he said urgently. "We have to go faster." I glanced at the road, but there was nothing unusual to see. The rain was still coming down hard, and the darkness made it hard to see much of anything. I pushed the accelerator, trying to increase our speed, but the man's fear was contagious. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. A few miles down the road, I saw something in the distance. It was an old, abandoned truck parked on the side of the highway. Its lights were off, and it looked like it had been there for a long time. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. "That's it," the man said, his voice barely a whisper. "They've been watching us." I could see the fear in his eyes, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I looked back at the abandoned truck, but it was hard to make out any details in the darkness. It just looked like a shadowy, eerie presence on the side of the road. Suddenly, the man was gone. I glanced over, and he was no longer in the passenger seat. The door was open, and the seat was wet where he had been sitting. I jumped out of the truck, searching the area, but he was nowhere to be found. The rain was still pouring, and the road was silent. I got back in the truck, my heart racing. I felt a mix of confusion and fear. What had just happened? Where had the man gone? And what was he running from? The rest of the drive to Salt Lake City was a blur. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and every shadow and noise made me jump. When I finally arrived in Salt Lake City, I was exhausted and shaken. I tried to forget what had happened, but it was impossible. The image of the abandoned truck and the man's terrified face stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, I tried to put the experience out of my mind. I focused on my work and tried to keep busy. But every time I drove that route again, the memory of that night would come flooding back. I would glance nervously at the side of the road, half expecting to see the abandoned truck or the man standing there, waiting for help. One night, I decided to drive the same route again, hoping to find some answers. I drove through the same stretch of highway, watching for any signs of the old truck or the man. The rain was falling again, and the road was just as dark and empty as before. As I drove, I noticed that the landscape seemed different. The trees and fields looked unfamiliar, as if the road had changed somehow. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and focused on driving safely. Then, I saw it, a familiar shape in the distance. It was the old, abandoned truck, just like the one I had seen before. My heart skipped a beat, and I slowed down to get a better look. As I approached, I could see that the truck was still there, just as before. It was covered in dirt and grime, and the lights were still off. But there was something new, something that hadn't been there before. There were strange markings on the road around the truck. They looked like symbols or patterns, drawn in the dirt and mud. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized that these markings seemed to form a circle around the truck, almost like some sort of ritualistic pattern. I got out of the truck and approached the old vehicle cautiously. The rain was still falling, and the air felt heavy with tension. I could see that the truck's door was slightly open, and I peered inside, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The rain pounded on the ground, and the darkness made it hard to see anything. I felt a wave of fear and turned back towards the abandoned truck. As I stepped closer, I saw a figure standing near the truck. It was a man, but he was different from the one I had picked up before. His face was hidden in shadow, and he seemed to be watching me with an eerie calm. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, he began to walk slowly towards me. I could see his clothes were old and tattered, just like the man from before. The sense of dread grew stronger as he approached. I turned and ran back to my truck, my heart pounding in my chest. I jumped into the cab and started the engine, not daring to look back. The rain was still pouring, and the road was slippery, but I pushed the truck to its limits, desperate to get away from whatever was out there. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing behind me. The old truck and the figure had disappeared into the darkness. I drove for miles, not stopping until I reached a small town with a 24-hour diner. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands still shaking. I went inside and sat down at a booth, trying to calm my nerves. The waitress gave me a curious look but didn't ask any questions. I ordered a cup of coffee and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The diner was quiet, and the only sound was the hum of the coffee machine and the occasional clink of dishes. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even inside the diner. Every shadow and noise made me jump. As I sat there, I thought about the abandoned truck, the strange markings on the road, and the eerie figure I had seen. I couldn't understand what was going on or why I kept encountering these strange and frightening events. Eventually, I finished my coffee and left the diner, feeling more on edge than ever. I drove the rest of the way back home, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. The drive was long and lonely, but I finally made it to my own bed, hoping to put the experience behind me. But even now, every time I hit the road, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me. I keep my eyes peeled for any sign of the abandoned truck or the mysterious figure. The memory of that night still haunts me, and I wonder if I'll ever find out what really happened. I know one thing for sure: there are some stretches of highway that hold more than just asphalt and lines. Sometimes, they hold secrets that are better left undiscovered. It was a dark, moonless night when Bobby Hartwell rolled onto Highway 66, the old route that wound through the forgotten, shadowy parts of the country. The night shift was always the hardest, and tonight, Bobby's fatigue was gnawing at him. His truck's engine roared as he pushed through the night, eager to reach his destination and catch some much-needed rest. The road was deserted, the only light coming from the headlights slicing through the inky blackness. Bobby flicked the switch on his CB radio, hoping for some chatter to keep him awake, but all he heard was static. He yawned, his eyes heavy, when suddenly a flicker of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought it was just another truck catching up to him, but the lights grew brighter, and the engine's roar grew louder. Bobby squinted through the rearview mirror, noticing the headlights didn't seem to be on a truck but a vehicle with an unusual, almost ominous glow. Curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to pull over and see what was going on. He eased his rig onto the shoulder and waited as the strange vehicle approached. It was a large, black truck with no visible markings, its windows darkened and its grille gleaming with an unnatural sheen. The vehicle slowed as it passed, and Bobby felt a shiver run down his spine. As the truck passed, Bobby noticed something peculiar. The driver's seat was empty, but the truck seemed to be operating smoothly, almost as if guided by an unseen hand. Bobby's unease deepened as the black truck disappeared into the night. He climbed back into his cab and shook off the feeling, convincing himself it was just his imagination playing tricks. He resumed driving, but the eerie presence of the black truck lingered in his mind. The road stretched on endlessly, and Bobby's fatigue began to set in again. Just as he was about to drift into a trance, the CB radio crackled to life, breaking the silence with a distorted voice. "Midnight convoy, join us." Bobby jolted upright, his heart racing. He tried to respond, but the radio was filled with garbled noise. The voice continued, growing more insistent. "Join us, or become one of us." A cold sweat broke out on Bobby's forehead. He turned off the radio, hoping the voice would disappear, but it only grew louder, filling the cab with a haunting chant. The temperature in the truck dropped suddenly, and Bobby's breath fogged up the windshield. Out of nowhere, the black truck reappeared in his rearview mirror, its headlights glaring menacingly. It closed in on him with frightening speed, its engine growling like a beast. Bobby's pulse quickened as he tried to speed up, but the truck seemed to be matching his pace, its headlights blinding him. Desperate, Bobby swerved off the highway, seeking refuge in the cover of a thick forest. He pulled up to a rundown, abandoned gas station that seemed to have been deserted for years. The black truck followed, its eerie lights cutting through the darkness like searching eyes. He abandoned the truck and ducked behind the gas station, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The black truck came to a stop outside, the engine shutting off with a final, resonant thud. Bobby watched from his hiding spot, trying to control his trembling hands. The truck's doors creaked open, but there was no sound of footsteps. From the shadows, figures began to emerge, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and eerie, mechanical movements. They were like ghostly apparitions, their faces etched with despair. Bobby realized with horror that they were the souls of truckers lost to the night, doomed to roam the highway forever. One of the figures turned toward the gas station, its gaze locking onto Bobby's hiding spot. It began to move toward him, dragging its feet with a ghostly shuffling sound. Bobby's terror was palpable. He knew he had to escape, but his legs felt like lead. As the figure neared, Bobby made a break for his truck. He jumped into the cab, the cold air inside stinging his skin. He started the engine, his hands shaking as he put the truck in gear and sped back onto the highway. Behind him, the black truck and its ghostly occupants seemed to fade into the night, their haunting wails echoing in the darkness. Bobby didn't stop until he reached the safety of a well-lit truck stop miles away. The black truck was nowhere to be seen, and the eerie presence had vanished. Exhausted and shaken, he told the other truckers about his encounter, but they merely looked at him with a mix of disbelief and concern. As Bobby tried to forget the night's horrors, he learned that the old Highway 66 had a history of disappearances and strange occurrences, often tied to the so-called midnight convoy. No one knew for sure what happened to those who encountered it, but the story was clear. The convoy was a spectral band of truckers forever bound to the road, and those who crossed their path were never the same. To this day, Bobby still hears the distant growl of a truck engine in the dead of night, a reminder of the midnight convoy that almost claimed him. And every so often, when he's alone on the road, he can't help but glance in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see those ominous headlights shining in the darkness. Tom was a long-haul trucker, well acquainted with the loneliness of the open road. On a particularly quiet night, he found himself on an isolated stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. His GPS had gone out, and the only company was the hum of his engine and the occasional flicker of his dashboard lights. Around midnight, Tom spotted a dimly lit truck stop in the distance. It seemed like a godsend, somewhere to rest and grab a bite. As he pulled in, he noticed the place was oddly deserted. The neon sign buzzed weakly, and the gas pump stood idle. He parked and walked into the diner. The inside was just as eerie, dusty tables, flickering lights, and a cold, stale smell. A lone waitress, dressed in vintage garb, stood behind the counter. Her eyes were dark and hollow. "Evening," Tom said, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. "Can I get a coffee and a sandwich?" The waitress nodded and moved with an unnatural, jerky grace. As Tom waited, he noticed an old photograph on the wall, a faded black and white picture of the truck stop from decades ago, with a different set of people standing in front of it. They all had vacant, unsettling expressions. The coffee arrived, and as Tom took a sip, he noticed the waitress had vanished. The silence grew heavier, and the lights began to flicker more erratically. Tom glanced around nervously, then back at the photograph. The people in it seemed to be staring directly at him now, their eyes following his every move. A sudden chill ran down his spine. Tom turned to leave, but the door was now firmly shut. He pounded on it, but it didn't budge. Desperate, he tried the windows, sealed tight. The realization hit him. He was trapped. A low rumble echoed through the diner, and Tom's truck outside began to vibrate violently. Shadows danced on the walls, and whispers filled the air, growing louder and more frantic. The waitress reappeared, her face now a ghastly mask of despair. "We're all waiting," she whispered, her voice a haunting echo. "Waiting for someone to join us." Tom's heart raced as the lights flickered wildly. He noticed the photograph again. The figures in it were now moving, slowly walking towards the edge of the frame, as if trying to step out. The diner began to warp and twist, the walls bending inward. Tom grabbed a chair and smashed it against a window. It shattered, and he leaped outside. The truck stop was now just an old, abandoned building, crumbling under the moonlight. Tom scrambled back into his truck and drove away, never looking back. He avoided that stretch of highway for the rest of his career. But sometimes, late at night, when he was alone in his cab, he could still hear the whispers from the diner, reminding him of the last stop he'd ever make.